Okay, I think we need to go ahead and get started. We're having a little bit of a technical challenge right now with with our moderator, Susan Beaudry, getting connected properly. But we'll go ahead and get started. And Susan, I'll just advance the slides through yours, and we will keep trying in the background to make sure that you're connected. So welcome everyone to another of our regular series of webinars sponsored by the Foundation Review. We'd like to thank our underwriter, Breckenridge Capital Advisors, for underwriting today's presentation so that all of our participants here could join at no cost. This webinar is sponsored by the Foundation Review, which is a quarterly peer-reviewed journal of philanthropy published by the Johnson Center for Philanthropy at Grand Valley State University, and our Ohio Philanthropy slide, and by Philanthropy Ohio is co-sponsoring this webinar. And for some reason, okay, if you have technical difficulties, which we typically our participants don't, I'm sorry, our moderator is having a little bit of a challenge here. Encourage you to jot down this phone number and email. U.S. and Canada, 800-843-9166, or help@readytalk.com, and they will have technical assistance available to you. This webinar is based on the article Impact Investing, a 21st Century Tool to Attract and Retain Donors, that appeared in the last issue of the Foundation Review. When you received your link to register to log on to this webinar, you should have also received the link to get that article from our website. You can always go to www.foundationreview.org and you'll find it there. All right, so our agenda for today is that this is Terry Behrens. I'm the Editor-in-Chief of the Foundation Review speaking, and I'm just going over a few housekeeping items to get us started. I'm then going to turn it over to Susan Beaudry, who will be moderating for us today. And then we will turn to our presentation from Amy, Kathy, and Robert from the Greater Cincinnati Foundation. We'll pause for any questions of clarification. And then we're going to hear some comments from David Newton and William Ginsberg from the Community Foundation for Greater New Haven, and then we'll turn to questions and comments. So I'd like to encourage you to use your chat screen to send in comments, your comments and questions, and we will be monitoring those, and then Susan, our moderator, will pose those questions to the panelists. Before we jump into the webinar, before I turn this over to Susan, I wanted to get a sense for what's going on with the folks on the call. So if you could give us, take a moment, you can just click on here and respond to this question. What is the #1 challenge you are facing in implementing an impact investing program? And I ask you to click one. Identifying good deals, identifying donors, getting board buy-in, getting staff buy-in, lack of staff expertise, or other. If this is not applicable, go ahead and click other. Okay, lots of others on here, so I'm thinking it's probably a lot of NAs. And we're seeing a spread with the others between board buy-in and staff expertise. Okay, so it's staff expertise and board buy-in appear to be the two major barriers or challenges for folks who are considering implementing an impact investing program. All right, I am now going to turn this over to our moderator, Susan, and it looks like you are working now, hopefully. And you
yes, I'm here, and good afternoon, everybody. I want to first welcome our colleagues in Cincinnati. We have Amy Chaney, the Vice President for Giving Strategies at the Greater Cincinnati Foundation, Kathy Merchant, President and CEO, and Robert Killens, the Program Director all these folks are at the Greater Cincinnati Foundation. We're also being joined today by colleagues in Connecticut. David Newton serves as the board chair for the Community Foundation for Greater New Haven. And Will Ginsburg is the president and CEO. I want to thank you all very much for joining us. Terry kind of outlined how we'd like you to share any questions with us. Please feel free to do that throughout the course of the webinar, and we'll be tallying those and taking a look. We've got time at the end to kind of review those. And I'm going to turn it over to Amy to get the program started.
Thank you, Susan. I wanted to start today with a really quick overview of the Greater Cincinnati Foundation and share with you that in 2013, GCF is 50 years old. Our service area includes 8 counties across parts of 3 states, and at the end of 2012, our assets stood at $473 million. As you can see, 30% of our assets are in endowed community and field of interest funds. This is actually a correction to the number, but still about 40% of our assets are in donor advised funds, but we have nearly 900 of them now. And then about 30% of our assets are donor designated and scholarship funds. All right, Kathy.
Good morning or afternoon, wherever you are. This is Kathy Merchant. I wanted to start us off very briefly with a definition of impact investing so we can all be on the same page about that. Unlike what most of us are familiar and comfortable with, impact investing is the use of assets for investment capital to address the very same kinds of social, environmental, or economic challenges that we might work on with our grants, but in this case to achieve a return of principal and ideally financial return. One of the things that's important to understand as a backdrop about impact investing is that it really can be used very broadly to deal with things like cash to venture capital. You can invest locally, which is what we as a community foundation do. Others are global impact investors. Your return expectations and your profile and your portfolio can range from, frankly, zero if you chose, but from below market to market rate. And on the next slide, I want to show you a little bit more about that. And finally, you can use structures that range from funds and intermediaries for a little bit of protection on risk to direct transactions directly in either nonprofits or for-profit entities who are working in the same space that you are. So on the next slide, there's a spectrum that we rather like to use. This was developed initially by the F.B. Heron Foundation and has been widely replicated because it gives, I think, the clearest message about the full range from grants on the left side all the way to market rate investments on the right side and everything that falls in between to show you that there are lots of different ways that you can take the capital, the assets of your organization, and generate resources to do good in your community, essentially to achieve the very goals that you were set up to achieve. We have a couple of pieces of advice for all of you that are predicated on our experience now over a couple of years trying to figure out how we can both create a robust program with our discretionary money plus include donors, and we'll touch on that in a moment. But we think that, at least where we live, it was most important and the right thing to do for us to start with using our own discretionary community funds. We needed to have some proofs of concept that we could share with our donors that we understood what we were doing in a new arena and could safely ask them to join us. Our strategy for impact investing was based on what we do normally every day, and so we encourage all of you to think about your organization capability, both the mission of your organization and the objectives and goals that you may have set for your grant making, because as you will see later, we use exactly that framework for our impact investments, and also the financial parameters that you're comfortable working with. Some people are not comfortable in doing anything but grants. Some people are comfortable only doing market rate investments, and we have allocated through that middle zone for ourselves. you need to especially understand the pipeline for investments. When we started this process early on, one of our biggest worries was that with a limited understanding of only traditional ways of doing lending in our community, that we would very quickly run out of investment opportunities. And with a shift of lens, of prism, to the full range of things that we invest in, we found out that there are many, many ways that we can make a difference with loans and equity investments that were actually new to us, but very exciting. Because it's a little bit scary to make a direct investment in an organization or in a sector when you don't know very much about it, you don't know all the players, you don't know all the sophisticated aspects of a sector, we felt that it would be smartest to use intermediaries where we could, because those are the people who really understand the depth of their sector. And then finally, and we'll come back to this a little bit later, Amy will share more on this, we thought it was very important to engage our donors basically one at a time. This is the underscore, one at a time. This is very personal, very much about the heart, and even though it's incredibly time-consuming to explain multiple times to go through that engagement process, in our view, it's the only way. One of the questions I get asked a lot is about governance, how you can make sure that your board both understands and buys into this process. We agree with you, it is very key, but you have some choices about how you handle impact investments within your organization. Our choice was to create a separate impact investment committee made up of a range of people who have investment and lending experience, and a couple of lawyers, those are key. And we also gave that committee delegated authority from our board to make the impact investment decisions right at the committee level and to have those actions ratified by our board. That was important because when you get into people are used to, I think, a degree of patience in the grant-making process, not so much with loans and even less with equity investment, so we had to create for ourselves a more nimble but equally rigorous, if not more rigorous, process to make sure that those would be well done. And the last thing, the investment policy, we had to write a brand new investment policy. We had one when we first started our program, but we had to write a more detailed investment policy, which, by the way, we're happy to share with anyone who might like to have it. We share all that we have, but it really lays out in great detail what we're trying to do, how we're trying to do it, how we'll know if we'll be successful, what the due diligence elements look like, and so on and so forth. And now I'm going to shift to my colleague Robert to talk to you about that all-important pipeline.
Yeah, as Kathy said before, early on we had concerns about, would we have a pipeline after we got beyond the sort of the tried and true, but we think we've done a very good job. But in terms of pipeline development, initially you want to build a pipeline of early wins. So you want to look at the things that may be familiar to you, and for us, we started in community and development, community and economic development, so that was a space that we were familiar with, and it's an easy space because typically there's a physical structure for which you can put a lien, and all of the traditional things are already in place. The other key, as Kathy said, is that we were fortunate to have a few intermediaries, and those might be CDFIs in your community, but groups that have established history and track record of taking in investments and managing those investments. Another group for us locally was LISC, the Local Investment Support Corporation, was another intermediary. And then the other thing is that once we got into it, it was very important for us to proactively source opportunities through networks and through partners and through having conversations, because what you'll discover over time, once you commit to this kind of program, is that many of the nonprofit partners that you talk to are used to thinking about grants and working with grants. So it's a new conversation to start talking about what if there was additional capital. So you'll discover that there may be some deals there that they would like to do but have not brought forth because they didn't think getting capital would be possible. And then the other things, again, making sure you ensure that the parameters are clear. These are investments, as Kathy stated earlier. They're not grants. You want and expect a return of the capital, and ideally you want and expect a small, sometimes or even a market rate return, but you are looking for a return. And then finally, as I said, you want to be creative, look outside the traditional community development opportunities. You might start there, but you want to then continue to expand beyond that. And for us, what guides our thinking is our community investment framework. And this is the framework that both guides, as Kathy stated, our investments through grants, but it also is the framework that we use to help us source and think about the kind of impact investments we'd like to make. And so what you see there highlighted in the blue bricks are the areas that we are focusing on. And to the left, and I know the text may be a bit small, educational success, you'll see that we have strategies in each of those areas. So we're not trying to tackle the whole space of educational success or health and wellness or any of the others. We have some strategies that we're trying to focus on. And so these are the areas that we are actively looking to source deals, and in some cases, in our case, as we've matured, we're actively out pushing concepts with credible partners that we could create deals. So in terms of evaluations, one of the things that we start with, or the thing that we start with, is what is the social return? What are we trying to achieve from an impact standpoint? If there is not a compelling social return, then it's probably a deal that we're not going to do, because again, we're not looking simply to do financial transactions. We're looking to have significant community impact, the same as we are with our grants. And in fact, we are, in most cases, looking to have the scale of impact that we can't do with a grant alone. So having a solid social return starts the conversation. Then next, we want to then work with a solid and credible partner. So we do an organizational assessment, because even if the concept itself is solid, if you don't have a credible, solid partner to work with, then you're going to probably have some problems over time. Then, and only then, we will start to look at what are the financial returns, the financial opportunities that the deal presents. So it's sort of in that order. We first start with a strong and compelling social return, then make sure we have a strong, incredible partner, and then we get into the financial aspect of a deal. In terms of our history, we made our first impact investment actually about 12 years ago, 2001. It was $1 million investment. It was to support market rate housing in our downtown business district. And if you were to see our downtown business district today in terms of housing, it's made quite a, it's like night and day. Now, we can't obviously claim credit for all of that, but we felt that we were a very important and early catalyst to a lot that has gone on. And then more recently, in 2008, we set up a fund and put $5 million into that initial pool. And we quickly, between 2008 and 2011, allocated most of that $5 million. And then the board was willing to expand our pool to $10 million in 2011.
Back in 2010, we began to assess the possibility of having donors participate with their donor-advised funds in impact investments, and they would do that right alongside GCF's own investments. We thought about it and realized that as individuals, we don't often have the ability to, or the opportunity to make loans to nonprofit organizations, and if you do, it's not a tax-deductible event. So that's part of the reason why we thought this was kind of an interesting thing to consider, involving donor-advised fund assets in the mix. As we did this assessment, we had 3 focus groups over a period of a month or 2, and 2 of those were comprised of donors, and 1 was made up of non-donors, at least non-donors to the foundation. As we identified the donors and prospects for these focus groups, we included some people who were sort of entrepreneurial, we had some younger donors, and we included some folks with legal, financial, or investment experience and added them all to the mix. In the focus group discussions, we tested the various program strategy elements and began by simply explaining the concept, much as we did at the beginning of this call. And then we tested a number of different options for participation. A couple of those options that we discussed were, first, the opportunity for donors to make grants into sort of an evergreen investment pool. The second was to have a separate investment pool that would be available sort of as just another part of the asset allocation for a donor-advised fund. And then another possibility that we tested with donors was the opportunity to invest in individual opportunities deal by deal, and for donors to sort of pick and choose. We shared with the folks in these focus groups very concrete investment examples to help them to envision what was possible and to elicit their reactions. And we asked them a series of targeted questions, including things like, would an impact investment be an attractive philanthropic tool for donor-advised funds? And for what purposes would you like to see impact investments used? How much would you be willing to allocate for a donor-advised fund impact investment? What level of financial return would you seek to achieve? And would you be comfortable with investment decisions being made by GCF's governance process? With all of the input from these different focus groups, we narrowed down the structuring options based on that input, and ultimately we took the whole set of recommendations that we had received to our governing board to have a go or no-go decision, and that occurred in December 2010. Through the process of getting input from our donors, we identified 3 goals for offering impact investments to donor-advised funds. The first was to attract more capital for local investment right here in Cincinnati. The second was to develop a new way to engage our existing donors. And the third was the possibility of having impact investments be attractive in bringing new donors to the foundation. In June 2011, we tested our kind of pitch to donors, and we also used a focus group kind of arrangement to do that as well. We included a group of donors. They gave us input that literally helped us to tweak the approach that we would take in reaching out to donors. And as Kathy said earlier, we do this one-on-one, in part because it's so different from anything else that we have done before and anything else we've offered to donors, and it just merits that one-on-one conversation to make sure that it's fully understood. But the pitch goes something like this. You have a donor-advised fund, and it's invested in a balanced portfolio. What if you could take a piece of that portfolio and invest it locally right here at home in a way that's going to do 3 things? First, it's going to make a difference. It's going to have a social return in our community. Second, it's going to have a return of principal back into the donor-advised fund. And third, it's going to have a small financial return. Would you be interested? And most donors overwhelmingly say, well, yeah, that makes a lot of sense. I'd like to know more. We also talk about impact investing as a way to sort of recycle charitable capital, and we emphasize that this investment is made right alongside GCF. Any donor participation will not be done alone.
So where are we today? Well, we've approved 10 impact investment deals since 2008. We've deployed about $5.5 million. Well, I think more close to 5.7 of the 10 million that we have in our investment pool. We have a donor-advised fund participation in 6 of these deals, and that participation today is at $640,000. As you see, that's 11% of the total investments that are approved. But it's more importantly in the deals where donor-advised funds participate, they're at 19%, so almost 20%. Is there, and so and we've had some some outstanding results of these investments in terms of the deals that we've been able to do.
On this slide, you can see the different investments where donors have participated. These are the 6 investments where donor-advised funds are involved. And the areas represented, I think, are kind of interesting. There is, the first investment is a housing-related investment, then there's environment, there's a health-related investment, new business development, human services, and minority business growth. And if you look at the total, or the donor-advised portion column, you can see the 2 investments which were most popular with our donors were Cinci Tech, which is the new business development opportunity, and 3CDC, which is human services. It's actually pre-development costs for a new homeless women's shelter in the community.
So we have just a couple of things that are very critical to the whole structure that we want to point out in our last minute or two. One major question is whether or not you include the assets that you're using for impact investments in your calculation for a spending policy. That was a hot debate here at our organization, and ultimately we chose to exclude it, even though it is in fact permissible, according to the UPMIFA Commission, to calculate the spending policy against impact investments. And if anybody wants references on that, I have them carefully sealed away in a folder to demonstrate that point. But ultimately, our board members felt that you can't really have it both ways. You can't really have the asset deployed to generate return, and I mean financial return, so that we can make grants from the spending policy and operate our organization, at the same time that you have those assets deployed for primarily social return in your community. Both things are very important to us, and so because we have about $100 million roughly in our unrestricted assets, that being the source of our funds, we removed $10 million of them from the spending policy calculation in order to be able to continue to use them for deployment in impact investments. It's a very complicated question. Be happy to answer any questions you may have. Staffing, just very quickly, I can tell you as the CEO of this organization that if the CEO is not on board with this idea, it will not happen. It is too complex. There are so many variables that you have to figure out. But the holy grail, so to say, of this whole process is that you can deploy an even greater share of the assets in your care to meet the goals that you have for your community. And to me, and to our board, importantly, that was worth it. You have to have your version of Robert. You have got to have someone who can dedicate themselves to identifying the pipeline. You have got to have your version of Amy, who understands the donors well enough to help you design a program that will suit them. You have to have somebody who understands how to communicate effectively this program, because you can't afford to communicate it the way we're trying to do in a hurried fashion with you today. It has to be very user-friendly. And then you have to answer the question, do you have the capacity inside your organization to perform the due diligence, or do you need to outsource that? I feel certain that the answer for many of you, if not all of you, would be outsource, and that is the choice that we made. So I think this is my second to the last slide, hurrying through this. The most important consideration to understand this slide is really what your financial parameters will be for each deal. It's tempting to say on the front end in your policy document, we want to get X% return. Well, we decided not to do that. First of all, no two deals are the same. Some deals would lend themselves to 1%. Some deals might lend themselves to 4%. Once you get up to 4%, you're really creeping into the market return zone, especially lately. Maybe not last year, but a couple of years before that, that would have looked really good, actually. So you have to structure the program in such a way that you can pay for outsourced due diligence if you decide to go in that direction, that you can generate a sufficient return of principal and interest to donors, interest I guess is what I'm talking about now, and then you've got to figure out how you're going to subsidize the staffing costs, because I've just described the people that you have, and our feeling was that we generate money sufficient through the fees that we charge to all of our funds to cover that cost, because we are still pursuing vigorously the same mission. And we are confident that the social return that we are generating is greater than grants alone could have achieved. So going forward for us, we now have achieved a discipline inside our organization. We have a relatively smooth operation. We are continuing to develop a pipeline. We have a meeting this week where we'll consider several new ideas. We will continue to approach donors. Our secret target was $1 million, and we're getting very close to that. We are about ready to begin the process of telling the stories of the difference that has been made with these investments, because our reports are now starting to come in. And probably later on this year, we will need to get some help in objectively evaluating this program. But I can tell you that so far we're quite satisfied. Thanks.
Kathy, Amy, and Robert, thank you so much. We're delighted to have you share this story, and it's really exciting what you've been able to do at the Greater Cincinnati Foundation. We've got lots of questions from participants, but before we kind of engage with some of those, I mean, you can see for those of you on the call that the Greater Cincinnati Foundation has really been working through this process, looking at what some of the obstacles are, identifying potential solutions, and really have a depth of experience. Our other presenters today on the call are more at the front end of this, and we really wanted to hear from them about the kinds of questions, concerns, obstacles they're encountering for some of you who may be on the precipice of really diving into this work. So I'd like to turn it over to David Newton and Will Ginsburg in New Haven.
Thank you, and good afternoon to everyone. This is Will Ginsburg. I'm the CEO here in New Haven, and I'm joined by my colleague David Newton, who is my boss, actually, not my colleague. He's the chair. So let me say a word about where we are. I think to the point that was just made, we are earlier in this process, but we do have some interesting activities underway, and we followed a somewhat different path than our friends in Cincinnati. I congratulate the Greater Cincinnati Foundation, Kathy and her staff, because they've been real leaders, not only a good model for us, but for so many in our field, particularly in terms of the work to get donor advisors involved. A word about who we are. I think in many ways we're a different kind of institution than Cincinnati in some ways, and represent a good counterpoint on some of this. So we're an 85-year-old community foundation serving 20 towns in south central Connecticut, centered on New Haven, which is a region of about 640,000 people. We're the community's charitable endowment. We're the community's largest grant maker by a substantial margin. We made over $21 million in grants last year. We raised about the same amount of money, although that's a coincidence. The community looks to us first and foremost for grant support, and we're very conscious of that in the context of impact investing, because if we open the door to impact investments broadly, we anticipate that we'll get approached by a number of people who are interested in having the foundation invest in what they're doing, both nonprofits and potentially for-profits. We have approximately, at the end of last year, about $380 million in assets. And I'll just say a word about the composition of those assets, because I think they're important to this conversation that we're all having. We are still, when we were founded as the New Haven Foundation, we were founded in trust form. We still work actively with our two large trustees, Bank of America and Wells Fargo. Less than half of our assets at this point are in trust, but our discretionary funds correlate very highly to our trust assets. So when we sit down to talk about the funds that are available to us to use for impact investing, funds over which we have discretion, that brings us straight to our trustees and the trust assets, and we'll say more about that in a few moments. Relatively speaking, relative to the Cincinnati Foundation, relative to many community foundations around the country, we have a relatively small amount of donor-advised assets, $34 million at the end of 2012, which is less than 10% of our total asset base. So the donor-advised strategy is less of a strategy for us, but again, as we'll describe in a few minutes, we've already established a major partnership with a donor around impact investing. And the last point is we manage not only our own endowment funds, but fund endowments of other organizations in the community, about $75 million in what we call organization funds, based on having a very sophisticated and ultimately successful investment management process. So one of the things we're known for in the community is the investment management work we do, and we need to, as we approach how to communicate an impact investing program, we have to keep that in mind as well. We do actually have a long history, and this goes to the next slide. We do have, am I supposed to advance this? There we go. We do have a long ad hoc history of doing various impact investments. When we built our own office building more than 20 years ago, we considered it what we called a mission-related investment and booked it accordingly. On several important deals, important to local development activities in the 1990s. We participated with local lenders, local banks in consortia to get those financed at below market rates. So there was a history going back to the 1990s. And in 2008, we used special grant funds. These were funds, we had received a grant from a bank foundation to do neighborhood work. When those monies got paid back, we in turn used them to make loans to local nonprofit housing developers. So we've had that program out for about 5 years now. Those are just about paid back at this point. So we did have experience using our, not endowment funds, but special grant funds for sort of conventional nonprofit community development housing kind of deals. A year and a half ago, we participated in refinancing with a $350,000 loan to refinance a supermarket in central New Haven. This was a deal that had been originally done back in the 90s as actually the first deal that closed under LISC's retail initiative. And it's a major supermarket, very important to the community, right in the center of town, and was occupied by a big regional New England supermarket chain that pulled out in 2010 or 11. So now there's another one in there, and we participated with local community development financial institution and other local institutions in refinancing this. The refinancing was done through the local neighborhood group, the Greater Dwight Development Corporation in the Dwight neighborhood, which is important. That's the way we wanted to do it, and we also, as one of the terms of the deal, we insisted that Greater Dwight take some portion of its return on this transaction and begin to create an endowment to support its activities going forward. So we were able to achieve some of our own neighborhood development goals with that. So we are now moving toward a more formalized structure to actually create a structure and a process for doing impact investing on a more formal basis, and we've taken steps over the last year or two to do that. And I'll turn it over to David Newton, our board chair, to describe some of those.
Thank you, Will. As Will mentioned, we've been doing this ad hoc investing, and there was an interest on the board's part in not only formalizing a structure, but also having some way in which to respond to what will continue to be some of what I'll call these one-off requests. So we, like Kathy and her colleagues in Cincinnati, used imprint capital, did an analysis of the market here, and detected some significant interest. And as a result, we recommended starting a pilot program funded by approximately $2 million. There's no real science to that number. It just seemed like a reasonable request to make of our two trustee banks. Again, as Will said, most of our unrestricted assets are with those two trustee banks, and we'll say something about this in a moment, but they appear to be interested. Our focus is going to be on economic development, job creation, and business development, and we did, from an internal standpoint, recommend an in-house management and decision-making independent of the investment committee. And like Cincinnati, we would exclude these assets from our spending policy for the reasons that Kathy mentioned. We're at least starting with a 3 to 5% return, though Kathy makes a very good point again that there may be some important investments that will only return 1% or no percent. The idea of having a return of capital is very appealing. And for us, the concerns are, frankly, sourcing the deals, making sure that we find the right kind of investment opportunities, particularly in a rather small market, which we have here in New Haven. Staffing, we are always concerned about adding more to the already prodigious load that our staff has. And then the trustee bank support. And we do have an indication from our two trustee banks that they're interested in doing this, and they would treat that money that they give to us for this purpose essentially like a grant. I mean, they're not looking for a return to them. They're looking for us to gain a return back to the foundation. We do have a very interesting opportunity, and I'll turn it back to Will. As a result of a couple of outreach programs we ran here, lunches on this whole idea of impact investing, we now have established, we now have a gift that has established the New Haven Teachers Fund. So, Will, you might want to describe that.
Yes, I'm happy to. So, actually, one of those we give credit where credit is due here. One of those outreach events we did to talk about impact investing was when Kathy Merchant was in New Haven, and we had a lunch, and we invited a number of our donor advisors and other donors and community leaders. Through a long story, we ended up with, at the end of 2012, so several months ago, getting a $1 million gift from a donor to establish a fund here at the Community Foundation called the New Haven Teachers Fund. So this is not actually technically a donor advised fund, but it is, we are working actively with the donor now, and we have the local community loan fund involved in this work with us to design a program to use this $1 million and to leverage other resources, bank resources and other resources, to create a program for subsidizing housing, initially home ownership, but potentially rental housing as well at some point down the road for New Haven public school teachers, housing in New Haven for New Haven public school teachers. Part of the background to this is that this foundation has staked out a major central role in the school reform efforts in New Haven through housing and operating and paying the administrative costs for New Haven Promise, which is a scholarship program and a partnership with Yale University and the New Haven Public Schools. So this is a very high-profile role of this foundation over the last 2.5 years, and this is one of the things that led these donors, this family, to want to do this project through us, because they saw support for New Haven teachers in this way and housing for New Haven teachers as a complement to the scholarship support and other support that's being provided by New Haven Promise for New Haven school children and their families. So we're very excited about this. I think this will be, lending for housing is very inexpensive now, so this will be a minimal, if any, return, at least in the early years on this. One of the goals of the donor is to capture the return from this fund through appreciation in property values as opposed to interest on an ongoing basis. So we're working with the New Haven teachers, the teachers union, et cetera, on this. So we're actually very excited about that. Another word just about the trustees, our bank trustees, as I said, Bank of America and Wells Fargo. Because our discretionary funds are largely, not entirely, but largely trust funds, we've been in conversation with the trustees about this for some time. Interestingly, when we approached, and for those of you who have trustee funds, this may be an important observation. When we originally approached our trustees about making impact investments, they were polite but basically uninterested. And where they came out basically was that they could not accommodate within their investment platform and the way they do their investment due diligence, they could not accommodate the time and special effort that would be needed to do a series of one-off private deals in New Haven. These are global financial institutions. So we went back to them, and instead of asking them to do this through their investment side, we asked them to make we are in the process of asking them to make a special appropriation under the special appropriation provisions of our Declaration of Trust of $2 million, which they would split on a pro-rata basis. It's not a lot of money. As David said before, this is for a pilot. We might go back to them for more later after a 3-year pilot. But for a $2 million special appropriation, which to them is like the appropriation they make off their trust funds every year through the spending policy. So we've gotten very favorable, much more favorable response to that idea, because this is what they're used to doing, and we're talking to the trust people at the banks, not the investment people at the banks now, and they would basically appropriate, it's not approved yet, but we're hopeful that it will be, a $2 million for us to set up our apparatus to pay for soft costs as well as the investments themselves in our investment program. So we're putting that together. We'll be going back to our board in the second quarter, I hope, for final approval of goals and the investment policy. We have a draft investment policy through the imprint study that David referred to. And then with the $2 million from our trust funds plus the $1 million from our donor, moving forward with a pilot $3 million impact investing program.
Yeah, and I think it's fair to say it has taken us some time to get all the various players together and for us all to understand was originally called MRI, or mission-related investing, and now called impact investing. Again, I think some of the groundwork that the Cincinnati Foundation has done has been very helpful to those of us who really are looking seriously at this opportunity. And I would hope that within the next number of months, we'll be in a position to actually formalize the structure and to start making some investments. We certainly will start making investment with the Teachers Fund. So that's the story from the Community Foundation of Greater New Haven.
David and Will, thank you very much. It's great to hear about sort of your history and how that led to your current position and how you're moving forward. We have several questions in already. They broadly relate to some of the key components of impact investing that you all touched on here. One, they have to do with the project pipeline development, rates of return, and evaluation. And I want to start first with it, since several of the questions deal with the project pipeline. In the article in the Foundation Review, the Cincinnati Foundation, you kind of explored that terrain and explained that CDFIs, LISC, and even the percentage of nonprofits that you identified that could really work a project pipeline deal with you was really limited. What are some of the potential ways to grow other investment opportunities?
Well, I think with the first thing, again, is trying to concentrate, if you have an intermediary, and start there. Because one of the things that you typically won't have as a lender and investor is that you won't have the requisite expertise to do the analysis of the organization or the entities for which the money will end up with. Said another way, if you're trying to invest in a lending program for small developers or small businesses, you typically don't have the underwriting expertise and the loan expertise to make those loans. And so the only way to support something like that is to work with an intermediary that has procedures, they have committees, they have expertise in doing that. And so working with an intermediary always is preferable in terms of starting up. But with the direct deals, it is very key that you have, as I said before, a solid organization that has, first and foremost, solid management, a solid track record of getting things done. It's well respected. Then you want to make sure that they have some on-balance sheet net assets, which unfortunately not enough of our nonprofits have that kind of strength financially in terms of their balance sheet. Because at the end of the day, you want the first line of recourse to be that organization's balance sheet. And so then you simply have to work then to see if a deal can be structured and if other assets can be brought to the table. But those are the sort of briefly the two things you want to do. You want to start with an intermediary that has the expertise and the financial strength. And then if you don't, if you have to go the route of a direct deal, making sure you have a very solid partner both organizationally and financially. And Kathy would like to.
I'd just like to add quickly, please don't forget, while you're impact investors, that you are also grant makers. So we have used grant money in 3 ways so that we could develop the capacity of nonprofits with whom we want to work because we're totally aligned with their goals. Number 1, you can insist that a potential borrower develop a very sharp pencil strategic plan and pay for it. We've done that several times. The second is you can provide technical assistance to a borrower if they're stretching in a direction, and by provided I don't mean us who work at the foundation, once again I mean pay someone who has the kind of expertise that you need your borrower to have. And then the third is that you can make a multi-year operating grant to a nonprofit in order to help them secure the capacity that they need to run a program. Our most recent example being, I think it was a 2-year grant to the Minority Business Accelerator to hire a lender so that they could spend our money wisely. 3 years?
Will,
a 3-year grant.
Will or David, you've got an immediate opportunity in front of you with the teacher housing opportunity. is this a shared concern for you around project pipeline development, or do you feel like there's some procedures in place to help you identify those in the future?
Well, when we undertook this is Will, when we undertook our consultant study, our feasibility study, the project pipeline was identified as an issue because, as David said before, this is a relatively small market. We are thinking along the same lines as Cincinnati articulated about doing this work primarily through intermediaries, and also in focusing on business development, job creation, and developing the economy. That is frankly a less well-developed area than the traditional sort of community-based organizations and housing, and which is easier because there are more intermediaries there, there's more experience, the banks are more used to it, the deals are more similar. So the short answer is yes, this is a concern for us, and it's one, but the flip side of it is we think that's where the value would be. Doing something more conventional is easier and probably less valuable in the end.
So our second category of questions here have to do with rate of return, both in terms of financial rate of return that you've experienced and sort of how you measure social rate of return on these investments.
Well, I'm sorry, you said is that a two-part about financial then social?
Yes, so I think some specifics around, you've kind of set this targeted amount of 1 to 5% on a financial return. Have you seen that met in the 10 deals that you're engaged in currently? And then kind of measurement or how you assess the social rate of return on the current investments.
Okay, well, financially, we've done some deals. I think the lowest we've done is 1%, and we've got a couple of deals at 3.5%, 3%, 2.5%. So we've got things between 1 and 3.5%. One of the other things that we want to say about rate of return is that at least on one of the deals we could have gotten 4%, but we left some return for the nonprofit itself because we want them, as a result of doing this deal or doing any deal, to be stronger on the backside than if we hadn't done the deal. So we've left some return, shared some return. That's another way to do it. In terms of our social return, we do that analysis up front, and for us, it could be, for example, on one of our deals with the Homeownership Center that Amy showed you earlier. That was a deal first and foremost to prevent potential foreclosure on about 38 properties. And so that was the first and foremost. The secondary would be neighborhood stabilization, because once you start foreclosure, it has a very destabilizing impact on neighborhoods. And then the third kind of return that we were looking for in that particular deal is the promise that those low-income homeowners sought by becoming homeowners, is that they would be able to hold their mortgages to term and have a financial asset that otherwise they would not have. And so with that deal, a year and a half in, everything is very much on target and progressing nicely. So that's an example of how we looked at social return.
I'd like to give you a slightly different example. I saw that someone asked a question about Cinci Tech and wondering what kind of a partner were we in that deal. For us, Cinci Tech is like an intermediary in that they are the ones who are pooling the funds from about, 16 or 20 different investors, and we are one of them. So we are not choosing the specific companies, and we are not investors in specific companies. There are capital calls that are managed by Cinci Tech. We do stand a chance of achieving market return and then some. They've had one exit, a pretty phenomenal exit so far that was 10x. So we'd be very happy to get 10 times our money back on any one of these deals, and only a couple of defaults, so far it's working very well. But the number one stopping point for us was new jobs in the community. Job creation and the cultivation of a culture of entrepreneurship in our community so that it can grow were the two reasons why we chose to invest in Cinci Tech. And so when we get our tracking reports for them, in addition to the financial stuff that you have to have, is new jobs created.
So one of the questions from participants online also have to do with different than a grant. When you see that that grant hasn't turned out the way that you had hoped or anticipated, there's just sort of a process for that. What do you do in a deal that may take some time to determine whether or not it's really moving in the direction intended, and may ultimately not be successful?
So I have what I hope you'll find to be an amusing story to tell in that regard. The litmus test for our Impact Investing Committee was, would you be willing to take down a nonprofit organization run by a nun if they go into default on your loan? And the answer was basically, yeah, we would have to be. But way before then, we know a lot about that organization, including the sister who runs it. So our own ability to vet organizational strength as if we were making a grant to it, I think it's pretty strong. That's what we do as community foundations. To be honest, if we can't do that, I think we should start over. But then secondly, as Robert tried to describe in the due diligence process, structuring, mitigating, risk mitigators so that your money is as secure as it can be. And then the third piece is to watch it like a hawk, perhaps even more closely than you would watch a grant, so that you know if it's getting in trouble. And once again, I have to say, don't forget you have a grant pocket. If the organization is getting in trouble, this is not a test. You want them to be successful. You need to dive in and help them, not only to protect the asset, but to benefit the community.
I think two final and perhaps quick questions here. One has to do with for the Community Foundation in New Haven, what's sort of the best piece of advice you could offer for people who really want to consider utilizing this tool in your process of moving forward with your trustees, with your donor? Is there sort of a takeaway that you can offer?
This is David. I think move carefully because there's a lack of understanding, I think, and even some misunderstanding around what social or mission-related investing or impact investing is. And so trying to bring everybody along as best one can does take some time. I would say also that a firm like Imprint has been very helpful in helping us look at ourselves and look at the marketplace. So the due diligence around starting a program like this, from my perspective, has been very important. I think our board is largely on board. There are still questions, but I think we're all comfortable that this is a space that we should occupy and that there is opportunity for us to do things in this community with this vehicle that we otherwise might not be able to. But it has taken some careful thought, time, and other resources to help us get to this point. I'll defer to Will to see.
Well, I think that's exactly right. I would just add one thing, which is to keep this in perspective. You know, this is still a small, even when we have our pilot up and full running, it will be a small part of what we do. Even if we get beyond that to a full-fledged program, it will be a small part of what we do. And you know, Kathy could comment on whether she thinks of it that way in Cincinnati. But one of the reasons, frankly, this has taken the time that it has is because other things have crowded it off, you know, into second position or into third position in what's occupying the time of the board and the time of the staff. And I don't mean to suggest this isn't important, but part of what we, to your question about sort of guidance and lessons, you know, is to keep this in perspective in the larger context of everything we do and the roles we play in our community.
I do want to note that the Greater Cincinnati Foundation has built a toolkit around impact investing with donor-advised funds. It's a really extraordinary tool and can answer some of the other kinds of questions we didn't have time to get to today. I would really encourage you to take a look at that. It's online. The team in Cincinnati, a question about sort of your best piece of advice on making the approach to a donor and a donor-advised funds about impact investing.
I think that the best piece of advice that I would have is just to present it in the way that I described in our formal presentation. That's been very successful, and that, as I mentioned, that approach was tweaked by donor input through the focus group. And so that is to say, you have a donor advised fund and it is invested. How about considering investing in a slightly different way that's going to do these three different things? It's been very well received with that approach. We talk about all the disclaimers and that there is risk, as there is with any investment. But that, I think, sets it out to donors as a new way to think about it. And the donors that we have approached, I should say, we mentioned we've been doing this very one-on-one, and we've sort of been very selective about who we approach. It's not going to be every donor advised fund. We've targeted our larger funds, our more kind of engaged funds, people we thought would have a natural interest in something like this. So I would give both of those as points of advice.
And Susan, before we sign off, could I just mention that we are working with the Council on Foundations and Mission Investors Exchange to develop a guidebook that will help specifically community foundations go through all of these questions. It's sort of like a toolkit on steroids, and I noticed that Ellen Remmer is on this call. Ellen is a part of the group who's also helping us put that together. So the outline is developed. It's under review and development right now, and our plan is to unveil that at the Council's annual conference in September.
That's great. Thank you, Kathy. And thank you all very much. This is a really exciting tool to think about how grant makers can use the other 95% of their funds. Thanks for your time and everybody's attention on the phone, and I will turn it back over to Terry at the Foundation Review.
Okay. Thank you, Susan, and thank you for partnering with us to bring this webinar to life today. I just wanted to remind everybody that you can look for an email from us that will provide a link to the slides and to the recording of the webinar. So look for that in the next few days. And again, thank you all for your participation, and we look forward to seeing you at our next webinar.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. Okay.
Thank you. Please stand by.